They were sure their tanks could not be beaten. The Type 95 HGO had already proven itself against Chinese forces, against Soviet tanks at Hulkin Gol, and in the big victories across Malaya and the Philippines. Japanese tank crews thought their light tanks were the best in the world, perfectly made for the jungles and islands of the Pacific. They had defeated every enemy they faced. They were wrong. The story of how they found this out does not start with defeat, but with confidence that came from many years of winning. The Hargo was not a random design. It came from careful military planning that started in 1933 when the Japanese Imperial Army saw a serious gap in its tank forces. The Type 89 medium tank, Japan's main tank, could only go 15 meters (km). This was enough to keep up with infantry walking, but it was too slow for the mechanized warfare the Army wanted. Japanese military planners had watched other countries build faster, more mobile tank forces. They wanted a tank that could move with motorized infantry going 40 miles outside by truck, a tank that could handle the rough land of Manchuria and China, and a tank that could be made in numbers their factories could handle. The Army Technical Bureau gave the specifications in July 1933. The new tank would weigh about 7 tons, have a 37mm gun, go 40 km/h, and have armor strong enough to stop rifle and machine gun fire. Most importantly, it had to be simple to make and easy to fix. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries got the contract. Engineer Tomio Hara, who was already famous for designing the Type 89, took on the job. His biggest new idea was the bell crank suspension system, a simple but effective design that would be used on Japanese tanks for the next 10 years. By June 1934, Mitsubishi finished the first prototype. The prototype impressed Army observers during tests in Manchuria and at proving grounds in Japan. It was fast, reaching 45 km/h on roads and keeping 25 to 30 km/h across rough land. It was very maneuverable, with a turning radius that seemed impossible for a tracked tank of its size. The Hargo suspension, with its special bell crank design, absorbed shocks well and let the tank move over rough ground that would have stopped other vehicles. It was also mechanically reliable, using a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine that made 120 horsepower at 1/800 revolutions per minute. The diesel engine was a point of pride for Japanese engineers because it made the tank less likely to catch fire than gasoline-powered vehicles. Diesel fuel was also easier to find in Japan's empire, especially in places like Manchuria and Southeast Asia, where gasoline was limited. The engine could run for 8 to 10 hours on its internal fuel tank of 34 litres, giving the tank a range of about 130 miles on roads. Tests showed some problems. The suspension could pitch violently on rough ground, which made aiming while moving almost impossible and caused crew members to get very tired. Engineers fixed this by adding braces to connect the bogie pairs, creating what became known as the Manchurian suspension. The fix helped, but it did not fully stop the rough ride that would be a feature of the Hargo for its whole service life. In 1935, at a meeting in the Army Technical Bureau, the Type 95 was officially shown as the possible main tank for mechanized infantry units. The infantry leaders were worried. They said that 12mm of armor was not enough for a tank that would help infantry attack strong positions. Cavalry leaders argued that the faster speed and mobility made up for the thin armor, and that the tank's firepower was enough for what it was meant to do. After long discussion, the infantry agreed to accept the design. The Type 95 Hargo was officially adopted. Its name came from the Japanese imperial calendar, marking the 2595th year since Japan's legendary founding. Only the last 2 numbers were used for the type number. Production started at Mitsubishi factories in 1936. The Hargo was a small tank. It was just 438 meters long, 2.06 meters wide, and 2.13 meters tall. In American measurements, that was 14 feet 4 inches long, 6 feet 9 inches wide. It was 14 feet 4 inches long, 6 feet 9 inches wide, and just under 7 feet tall. A man of average height could look over the turret. The weight was 7.4 tons for the basic tank, and 8.1 tons when fully loaded with crew, fuel, and ammunition. The armor was thin by any standard. It was 12 millimeters at the thickest parts on the turret and upper hull, 9 millimeters on the roof and floor, and 6 millimeters in less important areas. Japanese designers thought this was enough to stop rifle and machine gun bullets at normal combat ranges. They were making the tank for the enemies they expected to fight: Chinese forces with few anti-tank weapons and light Soviet tanks. Inside, the tank was cramped. The crew had 3 men. The drivers sat in the front left of the hull with limited vision through a small viewport and periscope. A hull machine gunner sat to the driver's right, using a Type 97 7mm machine gun in a ball mount. The commander was alone in the turret, standing on the floor with no turret basket under him. This commander had perhaps the hardest job in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had to lead the tank, directing the driver and communicating with other tanks when radios were available. Only one tank in 4 had a radio, so the others had to follow visual signals. He also had to operate the main gun, a Type 94 37mm cannon that could fire high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. He had to load that gun, a hard job in the tight space while standing. And he had to operate a second machine gun mounted in the back of the turret, pointing to the right rear at about the 5-rudder position. American tankers who later saw captured Hargos were amazed that anyone could work well under such conditions. The Japanese commander had no seat in the turret. He had to stand during combat, either with his head and shoulders exposed when the hatch was open for better vision, or squeezed into a tiny space with very little visibility when it was closed. The turret turned by hand crank, needing a lot of physical effort. There was barely room to move, let alone fight efficiently. But against the enemies it was made to fight, the Hargo worked very well. The tank first saw serious action in China starting in 1937 against Chinese forces who had almost no armor and very few anti-tank weapons. The Hargo was deadly. Its 37mm gun could destroy fortifications and stop infantry. Its machine guns cut down troops in the open. Its speed let it take advantage of breakthroughs and chase retreating forces. Japanese tank crews got combat experience and grew confident. They learned their skills in situations where their tanks were clearly stronger than anything they faced. This success gave them a dangerous belief that the Hargo was a truly powerful tank, rather than a vehicle made for a very specific situation. This belief was tested at Kulkan Gol in 1939, where Japanese forces fought the Soviet Union along the Mongolian border. Here, the Hargo met real opposition. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks had 45 mm guns that could punch through armor better than the Japanese 37mm. Soviet tanks also had thicker armor, which made frontal attacks very hard for the Hargo. The battles were fierce. On July 2, 1939, the Japanese 3rd Tank Regiment, mostly Type 95 tanks, attacked Soviet positions. The first attack had some success because of bold tactics and surprise. Japanese tanks destroyed 32 Soviet tanks and captured 35 armored vehicles. But Soviet counterattacks in the next few days showed the Hargo's weaknesses. Soviet guns could pierce the Hargo's armor at ranges where Japanese guns had trouble hurting Soviet tanks. By the end of the Kulkan Gol campaign, Japan had lost many tanks. The lessons were clear to anyone paying attention. The Hargo was no match for modern Soviet tanks. Its thin armor and weaker gun were not enough for tank-to-tank fighting against equal enemies. But these lessons were not fully learned. Japanese military leaders focused on better tactics and crew training instead of redesigning their tanks. The war in China went on, and there the Hargo still worked well. When war started across the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese tank units had huge success in Malaya. Hargo tanks moved through areas British commanders thought impossible for tanks. They went through rubber plantations and jungle trails, helping the fast Japanese push down the peninsula toward Singapore. British forces, which had not sent many tanks to Malaya, were not ready for this fast-moving threat. In the Philippines, Hargos landed with the invasion force and helped Japanese infantry. On December 22, 1941, north of Demortis, Type 95 tanks fought American M3 Stuart light tanks in what became the first tank-to-tank battle with U.S. forces in the Pacific. Both tanks had 37mm guns. The M3 had stronger armor, 32mm on the turret sides compared to the Hargos' 12mm. But at close range in the jungle, in the fighting, the Japanese had some success, destroying one M3 in the first attack. These early wins made the Japanese more confident. From their point of view, the Hargo was working exactly as it should. It was fast, reliable, and good at helping infantry in different types of terrain. Tank crews trusted their tanks. Commanders relied on their armor. And when orders came to defend Saipan, the Japanese brought their tanks without questioning if they were good enough. Saipan was different from earlier battles. The island in the Mariana chain was very important, only 1 to 250 miles from Tokyo. If the Americans took Saipan, their B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. Japan's leaders knew this. They put about 30,000 troops on Saipan, nearly double what American intelligence thought. Among the defenders was the 9th Tank Regiment led by Colonel Takashi Guto. The regiment had 44 tanks, a mix of Type 95 Hargos and the slightly bigger Type 97 Chiha medium tanks. The Chihas had better guns, 57mm. But the armor was still thin like all Japanese tanks. These tanks were a big armored force by Pacific standards, the largest the Americans had seen so far. The Americans started their attack on June 15, 1944. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered the landing force onto the shore at 05:42 hours. By 700, landing craft were moving toward the beaches. At 0840, the first wave reached the shore. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on Saipan's western beaches under heavy fire from Japanese artillery and mortars on the heights above the landing zones. The Marines fought their way inland against strong resistance. By night on the 15th, 20,000 American combat troops were ashore. Equipment and supplies flowed onto the beaches. Among them were M4 Sherman medium tanks landing from LST vessels and moving forward to help the infantry. The Marines set up a beachhead, but it was not fully secure. Japanese artillery could still hit the beaches. Counterattacks went on through the night. On June 16th, the Marines strengthened their positions and started moving further inland. The 2nd Marine Division worked to close gaps in the line, while the 4th Marine Division cleared areas around important terrain. General Holland Smith, in charge of the assault, sent in his reserves, bringing parts of the 27th Infantry Division ashore to strengthen the beachhead. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, leading the Japanese forces on Saipan, saw the critical situation. If the Americans fully secured the beachhead and brought all their combat power ashore, it would be impossible to push them back. He had to strike before they were ready. Saito gave orders for a big counterattack using the island's strongest units, the infantry of the 136th Regiment and the tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment. The attack plan was clear. The infantry would attack American positions around Karankanoa Airfield. The tanks would move southwest of Hill 164.6, going after the infantry started. The tanks were to charge the transmitting station and throw the enemy into confusion before the infantry entered the area. It was a bold plan that needed careful coordination between infantry and tanks in a night attack over tough terrain. Colonel Guto gathered his tank crews. They did last-minute checks on their vehicles. Crews loaded ammo, 37 beard set to Bedin, 10 rounds for the Hargos, 57 VD, 30 meters for the Chihas. They filled fuel tanks, checked track tension, and tested radios on the few tanks that had them. The crews were confident. Many had fought in China or earlier Pacific campaigns. They trusted their tanks and their tactics. In the dark before dawn on June 17th, the Japanese tank column moved out. Diesel engines coughed to life, their unique sound echoing across the pre-dawn land. Tracks clanked as the tanks lined up and started toward the American lines. Inside each cramped tank, crews felt the familiar shaking and noise of their machines moving. Commanders stood in their turrets, trying to see in the dark, coordinating movement with visual signals. The Americans heard them coming. Marine sentries on the perimeter reported engine sounds from the north. Officers shouted orders. Men grabbed weapons and moved to defensive positions. Anti-tank gun crews turned their 37mm M3 guns toward the approaching sound. Sherman tank crews. The Sherman tank crews, who had bedded down near their vehicles, climbed aboard and started engines. Machine gun teams checked their weapons and ammo. At 03:30 hours, the Japanese attack began in full. 44 tanks, the biggest group of tanks Japan had sent in the Pacific so far, moved toward the 2nd Marine Division's positions. Some tanks carried infantry clinging to the hulls, a risky but sometimes useful tactic. The formation moved through the dark, led by the front tanks and following the land toward their goals. Marine riflemen saw them first as dark shapes coming from the pre-dawn gloom. Then came the loud sound of diesel engines at full power, tracks kicking up dirt and dust, the clank of bogie wheels, and the squeal of steel on steel. Japanese tank crews could see Marines in their positions and the defensive line ahead. Some commanders started firing with their hull machine guns, sweeping the ground in front. Others held fire, trying to get closer before attacking. Then, something unexpected happened. Something that would change forever how Marines thought about Japanese tanks for the rest of the war. Marine machine gunners in foxholes and behind cover opened fire with their Browning M2 heavy machine guns. These were not the normal infantry machine guns, the 30 caliber guns used for supporting fire. These were 50 caliber heavy machine guns made to attack aircraft and destroy light vehicles. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was a powerful weapon designed near the end of World War I and improved in the years after. It fired a 12.7 mm bullet at a speed over 2,900 feet per second. The ammo included ball rounds for normal use and armor-piercing rounds made to defeat light armor and fortifications. The armor-piercing bullets could go through 23 mm of hardened steel armor at 200 meters. At 500 meters, they could still go through 19 mi. These were not guesses. They were tested and confirmed through many firing trials at American Ordnance Proving Grounds. The ammo was made to fight lightly armored planes and vehicles, not tanks. But armor penetration is unforgiving. The Type 95 Hargo's armor was only 12 mm thick at its thickest points on the turret front and sides. On the upper hull, the thickest armor on the whole tank was also 12 mm. Simple math showed the problem. The 50 caliber armor-piercing round could go through almost twice as much armor at close range. At the distances where the battle was happening, 200 meters or less as the tanks moved toward Marine positions, the 50 caliber had more than enough power to penetrate. Marine machine gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds flew across the battlefield in bright orange-red lines. The sound was unmistakable. The heavy boom, boom, boom of 50 caliber machine guns firing fast. Gunners aimed at the approaching tanks, some not fully believing their weapons could hurt armored vehicles. What happened next shocked both sides. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds didn't just dent the tanks. They didn't bounce off at angles. They went clean through, decisively. At close range, some rounds went all the way through the thin armor, entering one side of the tank and coming out the other. Even at longer distances, the rounds went through with plenty of energy left. Inside the Japanese tanks, crews faced something worse than defeat. They faced a shock. The heavy machine gun fire wasn't just loud hits on the outside of the hull. It was penetration, bullets going through the armor. In the tight interior of the tank, there was nowhere to hide. A round going through the hull could hit the engine, ammo racks, or crew members. The hardened armor made to stop rifle bullets gave no real protection against the heavy 50 caliber rounds. One Marine machine gunner, firing near the airfield, reported seeing his tracer rounds hit a Hargo coming straight at him. The rounds hit the front of the hull, and he could see sparks inside the tank through vision ports and hatches. The tank kept moving for a moment, then slowed, then stopped. Smoke came from the engine in the rear. The crew tried to escape. 2 men came out, but Marines in foxholes shot at them immediately. Another Marine gunner, his weapon on a half-track, aimed at a Hargo about 150 meters away. He fired a steady burst into the tank's side armor. The tank turned toward him, showing more of its side. He kept shooting. His loader fed another belt of ammo into the gun. He watched the commander in the turret slump forward, then fall. The bullet went through the thin turret armor, hit the man, and went out the other side. The commander never knew what hit him. A third Marine, manning a 50 caliber gun in a fixed position on the defensive line, fired at several tanks as they came forward. He aimed at one Hargo's engine compartment, targeting the rear deck where the cooling vents were. His bullets went through the thin 6mm armor covering the engine. The diesel engine, with its cylinders damaged by 50 caliber hits, stopped working. The tank stopped moving and became an easy target. The crew left it, running back toward Japanese lines under heavy small arms fire. Japanese tank crews who survived the first attack couldn't understand what was happening. They had trained for years. They had fought in China, where enemy weapons bounced harmlessly off their armor. They had faced Soviet anti-tank rifles at Khalkhin Gol and survived. Their tanks were supposed to keep them safe. That was the main idea of armored warfare. The tank's armor protected the crew while they fought with better firepower. But American machine guns were going through their armor. Not big anti-tank guns, not artillery, not even the huge 75mm guns on Sherman tanks moving into position. Machine guns, infantry weapons, guns mounted on jeeps and half-tracks on every American vehicle were destroying their tanks. The realization hit them hard. If machine guns could go through their armor, what chance did they have? A Japanese tank officer, later captured after his tank was disabled, told American interrogators that his first thought was that the Americans had some secret new weapon, some special ammo or gun that looked like a normal machine gun but fired strange bullets. He couldn't accept that a normal heavy machine gun could destroy a tank. In all his fighting experience, from training in Manchuria to battles in China, small arms fire never hurt tanks. Bullets only made noise on the outside. They didn't come inside. But the Browning M2 was totally different from anything the Japanese had faced before. Its armor-piercing bullets had enough energy and power to go through 12 mil Nathisarets armor at any range where a Marine gunner could hit it. And the Marines had these guns everywhere. They were standard weapons across the American military. As the Japanese tank attack struggled under this unexpected fire, Sherman tanks moved forward to fight. The difference was clear. Where the Hargo weighed 7.4, the Hargo weighed 7.4 tons. The M4A2 Sherman, the version used by Marines at Saipan, weighed 31.8 tons. Where the Hargo had 12 mm of armor, the Sherman had 51 mm parans on the front of the hull, angled at 56 centimeters to give extra protection, which was like 75 mm 3T meters against anti-tank fire. The Sherman's main gun was a 75mm cannon. This gun could go through the Hargo's armor from over a mile away. When the Shermans fired at the Japanese tanks, the result was clear. 75mm armor-piercing rounds hit Hargos and Chihas with deadly effect. Tanks were blown apart. Turrets were knocked off the hulls. Ammo exploded inside crew compartments. Japanese tanks that fired back found their 37mm and 57mm shells completely useless against the Sherman's front armor. The shells bounced off or made small dents without going through. One Japanese tank commander, whose Hargo was disabled by 50 caliber fire but whose turret could still turn, tried to fire at a Sherman at close range. He told his gunner to shoot. The 37 Davintiran Wild 14 millimeter gun fired an armor-piercing round. The bullet hit the Sherman's turret front. There was a flash from the impact. The Sherman didn't even slow down. It kept rotating its turret, aimed, and fired a single 75 mm round. The Hargo exploded. The battle became what one Marine officer later called a madhouse of noise, tracer fire, and flashing lights. Disabled tanks burned, lighting up other tanks still trying to move forward. Infantry riding on the tanks scattered, looking for cover in shell holes and drainage ditches. Some Japanese infantry reached the Marine lines, fighting desperate close-range battles in and around American positions. Marine infantry, hiding in their foxholes, had Japanese tanks rolling directly over them. One Marine later said a Hargo leaking oil drenched him as it rolled past. He stayed still until it passed, then threw a thermite grenade into the engine compartment as the tank moved away. The tank started burning from the inside. Another Marine, lying low in his foxhole while a tank rolled over him, jumped out after it passed and jammed a coconut log into the bogie wheels. The tank spun in place, tracks throwing dirt, unable to move forward. When the confused tank commander opened his turret hatch to see what was wrong, the Marine jumped onto the tank and dropped a thermite grenade into the open turret. The tank exploded from internal fires, setting off all the ammunition inside. By mid-morning on June 17th, the Japanese counterattack was finished. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks lay across the battlefield, counted by Marines walking through the area after the fighting ended. Some reports say as many as 35 tanks were destroyed, when including those hit by artillery beyond the main battle area. Maybe 1,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, including many tank crews and the infantry who had advanced with them. For the Marines, the victory was important, but grim. They had stopped a major tank attack, but the cost had been high. The 2nd Marine Division's commander later said that if the Japanese attack had worked, it would have destroyed the division's ability to fight. The battle had been close, decided as much by American firepower and Japanese mistakes as by overwhelming strength. But for Marines walking among the destroyed tanks afterward, looking at them up close, a different truth appeared. The Japanese tanks were not the strong war machines they had expected. A Marine officer called his men over to look at a destroyed Hargo. He pointed to the holes in the armor. They were clean, round holes where 50 caliber bullets had gone through. The exit holes on the other side were a bit bigger and rough, where the bullets tore through after going across the interior. You could put your fist through some of the holes. Inside the destroyed tank, the scene was worse. The tight interior showed signs of many penetrations. The commander's turret had no protection, no armor to stop heavy machine gun fire. The turret rotated by a simple hand crank. The gun controls were basic. There was almost no room to move. The hull machine gunner's spot was a tiny cubby with very little visibility. The driver had only a crude periscope and a small viewing port. Everything was tight, crude by American standards, and completely open to 50 caliber fire. Marines who had fought at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier remembered seeing Hargos there. At that time, with Marines mostly using light weapons and no tank support of their own, the Japanese tanks had seemed threatening. But now, with the right equipment, with heavy weapons and their own tanks, the Hargo looked exactly like what it really was, a light tank from the mid-1930s, good enough for what it was originally designed for, but completely useless for modern industrial warfare against a strong enemy. The psychological effect on surviving Japanese tank crews was huge. Those who were captured, whose broken tanks left them no choice but to surrender, had to face hard truths. Their tanks were not just weaker, they were old and outdated. The equipment they had trusted with their lives gave no protection against weapons the Americans used as normal infantry support. Intelligence officers questioning prisoners noticed a clear pattern. Japanese tankers were shocked at American firepower. They talked about the number and quality of American weapons. They mentioned the easy access to ammo and supplies they had seen. Many felt betrayed that their own leaders sent them into battle with weak equipment, while saying they had the same technology as the Americans. One veteran tank commander who had fought in China since 1937 told interrogators that he had believed Japan would win the war because of strong fighting spirit and devotion to the emperor. After Saipan, after seeing his tank pierced by machine gun fire, after watching American Shermans ignore Japanese anti-tank fire, he knew that spirit could not make up for weak equipment. Training and courage didn't matter when your weapons were fundamentally not enough. These reports were collected, studied, and sent to commanders across the Pacific. The lessons from Saipan shaped Marine tactics for the rest of the war. Japanese tanks were not a big threat. Standard infantry heavy weapons, especially the 50 caliber machine gun, worked well against them. Combined with bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and Sherman tanks, Marines had huge firepower against Japanese armor. The news spread fast through the Marine units. You didn't need special anti-tank weapons to fight a Japanese tank. Your 50 caliber machine gun would do the job. This knowledge changed how Marines fought in later island battles. The fear of facing tanks, the worry that armor would break through infantry lines, disappeared. Japanese tanks became just another target, and not a very dangerous one. The Battle of Saipan continued for weeks after the failed tank attack. Marines and Army soldiers fought across the island against strong Japanese resistance. The land was rough, with flat sugarcane fields, swamps, volcanic cliffs, and Mount Topchow, which rose 1,554 feet above sea level. Fighting in caves, ravines, and gullies used up men and ammo. The island was declared secure on July 9, 1944. The victory at Saipan had big effects far beyond the island. With the Marianas under American control, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. The psychological impact on Japanese leaders was serious. Emperor Hirohito realized that American control of Saipan meant Tokyo could be bombed. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned on July 18th. For the first time, Japanese media admitted the war was going badly. The loss shook Japan's confidence in winning the war. For Japanese tank crews across the Pacific, Saipan was a turning point. Word of the battle spread through military channels. Tank units on other islands heard what had happened. They knew their tanks were not good enough. They knew American weapons could go through their armor, but there was nothing they could do about it. The tanks they had were the only tanks Japan could provide. Japan's factories could not make modern tanks in large numbers. The nation's factories were already strained by years of war. Resources were limited because American submarines blocked access to raw materials from Southeast Asia. Japan's strategic priorities were aircraft production for kamikaze attacks and coastal defense guns for the expected invasion of the home islands. Tanks were not a top priority. Japanese engineers had designed better tanks. The Type 3 Chinu with a 75mm gun and the Type 4 Chito with even bigger weapons. But these were mostly prototypes and only small production runs. Only 166 Chinas were built during the whole war. The two Chitos never saw combat. They were kept to defend Japan itself. They were never sent to the island battlefields where they might have helped. Meanwhile, American production was almost unimaginable by Japanese standards. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, built by Chrysler, was a factory made just to build tanks. In December 1942 alone, the Arsenal's 5,000 workers built 97 Sherman tanks. That was more tanks in 1 month than Japan made in an entire year. The Arsenal was not the only factory doing this. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, was another. The government-funded facility was run by General Motors' Fisher Body Division. Fisher made over 11,000 Shermans in many different versions, making it one of the highest volume producers. Like the Detroit Arsenal, Fisher could build hundreds of tanks per month when running at full speed. American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, switched from making locomotives to building 2,300 Sherman tanks. Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia built over 2,200 tanks, while still making locomotives for the war. Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio built the first production M4A1 Sherman, a tank named Michael, which was sent to England and still is at the Bovington Tank Museum. Lima made 1,655 tanks before going back to full-time locomotive production. Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, Pullman Standard Manufacturing in Illinois, and Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio all helped make Shermans. 10 major factories, plus many subcontractors making parts, tracks, engines, radios, optics, and weapons, all contributed. The industrial effort was unlike anything in human history. The Detroit Arsenal itself was amazing modern engineering. Built on 567 acres in Warren, Michigan, the factory had over 1.5 million square feet of production space. Assembly lines ran for miles. Huge overhead cranes lifted whole tank hulls and moved them from station to station. The factory ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers included men who had been car factory workers before the war, bringing their experience to tank production. But thousands of women also worked there, many who had never done heavy factory work before. These women, often called Rosie the Riveters, welded armor plates, put together turrets, installed engines, and did every job in the plant except the heaviest lifting. They showed that the nation's industrial power could grow by using workers who had been mostly left out of heavy manufacturing before the war. By the time production ended in June 1945, American factories had built 49,234 Sherman tanks. Japan made about 2,300 Hargos over the whole war from 1936 to 1943, when production stopped. The ratio was more than 20 to 1, but even that doesn't fully show the difference because American tanks were much stronger individually than the Japanese tanks. Sherman tanks weighed 30 to 35 tons, depending on the version. They had armor from 51 mm 18 diameters on the front of the hull to 76 mm on the turret front plate. They carried 5-man crews with specific positions for each job. They had gyro-stabilized guns, which let them fire while moving. They had radios in every tank, making coordinated attacks possible. They were reliable, with tracks that could last 2,500 miles compared to 500 miles for German tanks, and maybe 1,000 miles for Japanese tanks. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II. It was outgunned by German Tigers and Panthers, but it was good enough and available in huge numbers. In the Pacific, where it faced Japanese tanks designed in the mid-1930s, the Sherman was more than enough. It was extremely superior. For Japanese tank crews on later islands, the same story happened that started at Saipan and continued on Tinian. In July 1944, 7 Type 95s were destroyed while attacking Marine positions. On Peleliu, in September 1944, Japanese tanks were dug into caves and used as stationary pillboxes, knowing they could not win in mobile fights. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, Colonel Taichi Nishi's 26th Tank Regiment buried their tanks in volcanic ash up to the turrets, using them as armored bunkers because the tanks were safer when still than when moving. Even as stationary defenses, the tanks were not safe. 50 caliber machine guns could still go through the turret armor. Flamethrower tanks could pour napalm into open hatches and vision ports, burning crews alive inside their steel coffins. Bazookas could pierce the thin armor from any side. The Hargo, once a symbol of Japanese tank strength, had become a death trap for its crews. On Okinawa, the last big battle of the Pacific War, the Japanese sent in the 27th Tank Regiment to defend. The regiment had 13 Type 95 Hargos and 14 Type 97 Kihas medium tanks, 27 tanks total. The Americans landed with over 800 tanks. The number difference was 30 to 1. The difference in quality was even bigger. On May 4th and 5th, 1945, the Japanese launched a big counterattack to try to push the Americans off the island. Tank units were sent in to help the infantry attack. The attack failed completely. Most Japanese tanks were destroyed in just a few hours, knocked out by a mix of Sherman tanks, bazookas, 37 Vidin B-E medium anti-tank guns, artillery, and 50 caliber machine guns. The few tanks that survived pulled back, achieving nothing except leaving more destroyed tanks on the battlefield. In August 1945, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, Japanese tank units in northern China faced another enemy with much better technology. Soviet T-34 medium tanks, with their sloped armor and strong 76 mm guns, were far better than the Japanese tanks they faced. In the Battle of Shumshu Island, part of the Kuril chain, Japanese tanks tried to defend against Soviet amphibious landings. The Japanese had about 77 tanks on Shumshu, including Type 97s and a few newer Type 1 medium tanks, but only 25 Type 95s. The Soviets used 45 mm anti-tank guns, anti-tank rifles, and anti-tank grenades with deadly effect. The Japanese lost 21 tanks in just 2 hours of fighting. Soviet forces, experienced in tank warfare from years of fighting on the Eastern Front in Europe, quickly defeated the Japanese defenders. The experience of Japanese tank crews in World War II, especially in the final years, was one of slow, crushing realization. What they believed about their equipment, their chances, and their ability to fight Allied tanks was completely wrong. And for many, the moment of truth came not in some big tank battle between strong tanks, but in the terrible simplicity of seeing machine gun bullets go through armor that was supposed to keep them safe. For Marines who fought at Saipan and other islands, the lessons were different, but just as important. They learned that Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. They learned that having the right equipment and overwhelming firepower made all the difference. They learned that their 50 caliber machine guns, which they had trained with and kept in good condition, were actually good anti-tank weapons in the Pacific when used against lightly armored Japanese tanks. There was no glory in these one-sided battles. Marines did not feel heroic shooting at tanks with machine guns and watching them burn. They felt a mix of relief, pity, and grim satisfaction. Relief that they did not have to face serious enemy tanks, the kind their counterparts in Europe fought every day against German armor. Pity for the men in those Japanese tanks who had been sent to die in machines that offered no real protection. Satisfaction that their weapons worked, and that American industry had given them the tools they needed to do their job. After the war ended, some surviving Hargo tanks were sent to the United States for close study at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. American engineers and armor experts examined them carefully for months. They measured the armor thickness at many points on the hull and turret, documenting all the differences. Front hull 12 veer. Ward parameterbim. Side hull 12 vinhen. 1 turn peneterm. Rear hull 10. Cani 12. Cano 13. To 12 mm. Turret front 12 mm. Turret sides 12 mm. Roof plates 9 mm. Belly armor 6 mm. They tested the steel quality using metallurgical analysis. The armor was face-hardened, which made the outside surface harder than the inside core. This method worked well against small guns, causing bullets to break instead of go through, but it did not stop bigger shells with enough force to break the hard outer layer and go through the softer inside. They studied the inside layout too, taking careful measurements and photos. The fighting compartment gave only about 50 cubic feet of space for the commander. He had to stand all the time with no seat and no way to rest. The turret ring was only 1/200 millimeters transiter wide, giving almost no room for a man to work while using weapons, loading ammo, and commanding the tank. The crew spaces were so tight they felt claustrophobic. The driver had a space about 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. His controls were simple, just steering levers, a throttle, and a gear shift. He could see through a small armored periscope and a small direct vision port that could be opened when not in combat. The hull machine gunner next to him had even less room, squeezed into a small cubby with his gun and limited ammo storage. American tankers who studied the Hargos could not imagine fighting in such tight conditions. Sherman crews, in comparison, had more than 150 cubic feet of space in their fighting compartment. Each crew member had a proper position with a real seat to work comfortably. The commander had a cupola with all-around vision blocks. The gunner had a telescopic sight and power traverse to turn the turret easily. The loader had space to move and could reach properly organized ammunition racks. The driver and assistant driver, called the bow gunner in American terms, had enough space and good vision equipment. Their reports confirmed what had been learned in battle and what math had predicted. The Hargo was a light tank, good for fighting poorly equipped enemies. It worked well in colonial wars, small police actions, or suppressing resistance where the enemy had no serious anti-tank weapons. It was not good for modern industrial warfare against a strong opponent with proper weapons. Any gun stronger than a rifle could defeat its armor. The 50 caliber armor-piercing bullets didn't just go through. They punched cleanly through with extra energy. Inside, the tank was cramped so much that it was dangerous even without enemy fire. The commander had too much work, handling all turret functions alone. Most tanks had no radio, 3 out of 4, making it nearly impossible to coordinate with other tanks. The hand-cranked turret was slow and tiring. The vision gear was basic, leaving the crew mostly blind to what was happening around them. Every part of the tank's design showed the limits Japan faced. Small industry, scarce resources, and a design based on fighting weak enemies. Comparing it to American tanks showed the difference clearly. The Hargo was tight and cramped, while the Sherman had plenty of space for crew members to move, switch places if needed, and work even in long fights. The Hargo had thin armor that could be pierced by machine guns at close range, but the Sherman could resist anti-tank guns at normal combat distances. Its 51 meteor points, infantry frontal armor, angled at 56 degrees, worked like 75 mm armor against anti-tank shells. The Hargo had one person in the turret doing many jobs at once, but the Sherman had 3 men in the turret, each with their own role and space to do their job. The commander could focus on leading the tank using his cupola with 6 vision blocks to see all around and direct the crew. The gunner focused only on aiming and firing the main gun, using a telescopic sight with magnification and a power traverse system that could turn the turret quickly and smoothly. The loader focused on keeping a high rate of fire, taking rounds from organized racks, and loading them fast and efficiently. The Sherman's 75 mm gun had a muzzle speed of about 2,400 ft per second with standard ammo, letting it penetrate the armor of most targets it would meet in the Pacific. The gun was stabilized vertically, letting it shoot accurately even while the tank moved, a feature the Hargo did not have at all. The Sherman carried 97 rounds of 75 mm ammo in protected racks. Compared to the Hargo's 130 rounds of 37 mm ammo stored loosely all around the fighting area, communication was very different. Every Sherman had a radio, usually an SCR-528 or STR-538 set, letting tanks talk to each other and coordinate with infantry and artillery. The Hargo had radios in only 1 out of every 4 tanks, leaving the others to use visual signals, a system that failed quickly in battle when smoke, hills, or enemy fire blocked sight. Vision tools on the Sherman included periscopes with replaceable prisms, direct vision ports with armored covers, and a command cup for seeing all around. The Hargo had crude periscopes and tiny vision ports that gave almost no awareness, forcing commanders to open hatches and expose themselves just to see around. Every design detail, from ammo storage to crew comfort to fire control tools to communication systems, was better on the American tank. But the biggest difference was not the tanks themselves. It was in the numbers and the industrial systems that built them. The United States had made an economy that could fight industrial war on a global scale. Factories that once made cars now made tanks at speeds that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The Detroit arsenal alone, in its best month, produced more tanks than Japan made in a normal year. Women who had never worked in heavy industry welded hulls and built turrets. Engineers constantly improved tank designs, adding lessons learned from real combat to make each new tank better and more effective. The supply chain delivered raw materials to factories and finished tanks to ports like clockwork. Merchant ships carried Shermans across the oceans to fight in Europe and Asia. Maintenance teams in the field kept tanks running, taking parts from broken tanks to fix others, and returning repaired tanks to battle in just a few days. Japan had never built this kind of industrial system. Its economy was already strained from years of fighting in China before the Pacific War even started. Its factories did not have the automation or mass production speed of American plants. Its access to raw materials, especially after American submarines sank merchant ships, was getting worse. The nation that had challenged the world's greatest industrial power was learning the hard way just how expensive that challenge was with every new battle. For the Japanese tank crews on Saipan that early morning in June 1944, and for every Japanese tanker fighting in the Pacific later, the lesson was cruel and simple. They were obsolete. Their tanks were obsolete. Their tactics, made for a different war and different enemies, were obsolete. And there was nothing they could do except keep fighting with what they had, knowing survival was unlikely and winning was impossible. The Marines on the other side learned different but very important lessons. They learned that industrial power matters in modern war, that having better equipment in bigger numbers makes a huge difference, and that courage, training, and fighting spirit, while important, cannot overcome a lack of good gear. They learned that the factories back home in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and many other cities were just as important to victory as anything happening on the battlefield. They also learned something very practical. When you face a Japanese Hargo tank, you don't have to wait for anti-tank guns, airstrikes, or artillery, though those are available if needed. You can fight it yourself with a .50 caliber machine gun. At close range under 200 yards, the armor-piercing bullets will go through. Aim for the engine, the sides, or the turret. The rounds will pierce the armor, stopping the tank and probably killing or wounding the crew. The weapon, made to shoot down planes and destroy light vehicles, works perfectly against Japanese tanks. It was a small lesson in a huge war, but for the men involved, for the Japanese tank crews who died in their weak tanks, and for the Marines who destroyed them with heavy weapons, it was a clear lesson. This was not a fair fight. This was not an even match. This was modern industrial war, where one side had way more and better equipment. The outcome was never in doubt. The Hargo tanks on Saipan and every other Pacific battlefield were more than just old tanks. They showed the gap between what Japan needed and what it could actually make. They showed the impossible situation Japanese soldiers faced, ordered to fight a superpower with equipment not made for that kind of war. They showed the results of decisions made years before. To focus on ships and planes instead of tanks, to think fighting spirit could make up for weak gear, to believe early wins meant long-term success. When those first .50 caliber bullets went through Hargo armor on Saipan, they proved a lesson that lasted through the rest of the Pacific War and later studies about why Japan lost. They proved that in industrial war between modern countries, how much you can produce matters, how you design things matters, and how you use your resources matters. No amount of courage, training, or skill can beat a 10-to-1 number disadvantage and big gaps in equipment quality. The Japanese tank crews who climbed into their Hargos that June morning in 1944 thought they were going into battle with good, reliable machines. By sunset on June 17th, the survivors knew the truth. Their armor was so thin that machine gun bullets went straight through. Their tanks were good enough for the 1930s war Japan had planned, but useless for the 1940s war they were actually fighting. And there was nothing they could do except keep serving, keep fighting, and keep dying in tanks that could not protect them.